Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. I wanted to do a quick monthly Marginalia video, just anything in the last month, any poems, short stories, essays, whatever I was reading that I didn't do any videos about, and then a couple of quick music recommendations at the end, some songs we particularly enjoyed on our trip up to the Canyonlands in Utah earlier in March. So just jump in with the stories, and my short story reading was all over the place in March, but I read a number of really good stories from Kafka, the Hunger Artist, and A New Advocate. And The Hunger Artist in particular is a very dark story. It's one of Kafka's more famous stories. It's links to his own autobiography as he was suffering from tuberculosis and couldn't really eat anymore. It's a very, very dark story, but one that is interesting to read, sort of a way of a character who we would seem to feel doesn't have any dignity that others are giving to him, and does he find the dignity in himself? I guess is sort of the question I have. And I think he does. I think Kafka allows the character to find that dignity. From Alexander Pushkin, a favorite from my friends over at the Codex Cantina, I read Kurdjali, which is sort of a weird, picaresque, humorous story, really, of like a character who sort of just gets one over repeatedly over others. And then The Queen of Spades, which is a very famous story, feels almost like a fairy tale. And one that I want to reread before I form sort of a final opinion. I know some people regard that as one of the finest short stories ever written, and I wasn't quite sure if I would put it in that tier, but it's certainly one I'm interested in rereading. And then two short story writers who I think are going to be kind of linked in my mind, just in terms of the sort of strange, fractured way they view reality. So the first is John Collier, who I was totally unfamiliar with. This is a collection called Fancies and Good Nights. And the stories were selected by Ray Bradbury, which was part of why I picked it up when I saw it, because I love Bradbury's stories, and I can see why as I read these. I read the first four, so Bottle Party, De Mortuis, Evening Primrose, and Witch's Money. And Bottle Party Bottle Party starts with this framing device of a guy who goes into almost like a pawn shop and finds these, bottles that says, oh, there's a genie in the bottle, and oh, the most beautiful woman in the world is in this bottle, and things like that. And so he buys the genie in the bottle, and it turns out there actually is a genie in the bottle, and there's some shenanigans ensue, but then it has sort of an O. Henry twist at the end, but in a very, very dark way, not in an ironic or humorous way, just in a flat-out dark way. And De Mortuis was particularly dark, but John Collier, someone I was unfamiliar with, and someone I'm going to be reading, throughout the rest of the year, certainly, and beyond. And then another short story writer who I was sort of familiar with, just his name and the titles of a couple of his works, but I hadn't read anything by him, and that is Julio Cortazar. He was an Argentine writer and was one of sort of the first writers from South America in the middle of the 20th century to start becoming famous. And of course there were numerous other writers along with him and after him, but he, along with Jorge Luis Borges, sort of were two of the earlier writers, I guess, who had become famous. So I read a pair of stories from him. I'm trying to remember how to pronounce one. Axolotl, and then House Taken Over. House Taken Over was really weird, and that's kind of the vibe I'm getting from Cortázar. Is it's not quite magical realism. There's stories that feel mostly realistic, and then there's not necessarily magic. It's more just characters who almost feel pressures and fears, and then they change their behavior in such a strange way that even though there's no magic involved, it does feel like a precursor to magical realism. House Taken Over has a brother and sister who feel that there's a section of their house that they hear strangers in, and so instead of going and confronting the strangers and saying get out or whatever, they withdraw, and then they keep withdrawing to smaller and smaller parts of the house until finally they're in just like they have the kitchen or the bathroom, and then finally they have nothing. So a very weird and interesting story, and someone I'll be again reading more from throughout the year. And then kind of just to relax, Songs of the Dying Earth, which are stories set in Jack Vance's great Dying Earth, world. And it's The Dying Earth by Jack Vance is an absolute masterpiece. Everyone should read it. And these stories are stories from science fiction writers who are just very deep fans of Vance. And so I was just kind of perusing these, and this is a great volume as well if you're a fan of The Dying Earth by Jack Vance, which everyone should read again. And then in terms of poems, not a huge amount of poetry reading this month, last month. I think here in April I'm going to be reading more. I've even got some anthologies sort of set out to dip into periodically. But I'm continuing to read the Psalms in English, and we're into the 18th century now. And I really enjoyed, there was a huge number of poems by a writer, Isaac Watts. And they were very strong. Many of them were very strong. Charles Wesley, who's famous with the Methodist denomination. There were some from Charles Wesley, and then Thomas Cradock, who didn't feel stronger than Wesley, but not nearly as strong as Watts. Watts is probably one of the top 3 translators of Hebrew poetry that I've found in this volume so far. But I'm up to Christopher Smart, who I've read most of his works before, and it'll be interesting to kind of put Watts and Christopher Smart almost back to back and compare those. I think that will be fun. My major reading project throughout the month of March has been Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch. This traces about 9 years in the civil rights movement from just before the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott up through the March on Washington. And I read more than 800 pages of it in March, but I didn't quite finish it up. And I probably will this weekend. It has been absolutely excellent. It has been marvelous. It really provides a panorama of the civil rights movement, but also, takes it down to a very personal level in terms of the courage, in terms of the horror, in terms of the decisions, and how so many of the decisions were just made. There wasn't a huge discussion around it. It was somebody made a choice, and others were inspired by that choice and inspired by that act to join. And I've really been enjoying it and learning a lot and relearning aspects of the movement. And so I'll probably have a longer video about this later on in April once I finish it. But with that, I also was reading just from some other books. So I have the Testament of Hope, which is the essential writings of Martin Luther King Jr. And this is a marvelous volume if you're interested in his thought. And it really does show the depth and breadth of Reverend King's thinking, Reverend Dr. King's thinking. And I specifically, the letter from Birmingham jail, of course, but also his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. That hasn't happened in Parting the Waters. It will happen, I believe, in the next book, The Pillar of Fire. And then also A Time to Keep Silence, or Time to Break Silence. And so, from 1967. So this is a great volume as well, highly recommended. With that, I was also dipping into my Library of America American Sermons anthology, in part because early on, Branch, it's a history of the civil rights movement, but it's also a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And so as he is developing as a minister, as an aspiring minister, as in seminary, who are the 20th century preachers that he was drawn towards and thinkers he was drawn towards. And so there were a couple who I found were in my anthology here, so I was dipping into those. Harry Emerson Fosdick, You Are Accepted by Paul Tillich, and I'm planning to read The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich in May. And then The Providence of God by Reinhold Niebuhr. And so just great reading there as well. Really, great minds who really sought to find a way to explicate how human beings need to love each other and act on that love for each other. In terms of, and then dipping in and out of the Pensées of Blaise Pascal. Those aren't really long lectures. They're almost aphorisms, and they're just sort of fragments. You could almost read one a day for a year. And some are very clever, some are very spiritual, some are more just witty, but very enjoyable. And then from Toni Morrison's Source of Self-Regard, she has a prayer for the victims of September 11th that is very powerful and very insightful. And so that was something else I had turned to kind of in that vein. And then closing out my reading, my Marginalia reading for March, I read Trifles, a one-act play by Susan Glaspell, inspired by Roz over at Scally Danling about the books. And that's just an incredible play. It's a very succinct play, but it's a wonderful play, just exploring like feminism, exploring, sort of that show don't tell type thing, and it works so well, and you can find it online for free. And then Umberto Eco, this is on literature, and these are mostly like lectures, not really essays. They're mostly lectures he was giving, and I just found this recently, but I read a couple of interesting ones. One was on some functions of literature, which was really, really intelligent, really interesting, and sort of asking questions. We can agree and disagree about this, but people who might have disagreements will all agree that within a text there is this sense of finality to what happens in certain texts, not all texts, but in certain texts, in a way that doesn't necessarily exist in life, as we have, different opinions even about what appears to have happened. And so that was a really interesting essay. And then he also had one on the style of the Communist Manifesto, where I'll disagree with him, but it was interesting to get Eco's thoughts on that. And finally, as I was reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, I was kind of dipping into my other Virginia Woolf works, and so I have her volume 2 of her essays, which this is like the teens, in the 19s, and predates Mrs. Dalloway, but it shows, one of the things that's really interesting about Woolf is many of her essays are ostensibly book reviews, but they're very much more essays than book reviews. Woolf uses the review to illuminate some aspect of literature or of society or of humanity that she's interested in, and that's what she spends probably 75% of the word space in the review on, is on this idea that all of these books that she's reviewing are really just gateways to some larger idea, some more important idea, and that reviewing the book has just stimulated this. And I like that. I her writing is excellent as always, but the way her mind, as the characters she shows in Mrs. Dalloway, the way her mind takes something and then runs with it is fantastic to witness. And then from her letters, this is Collected Letters, Volume 3. So there's a whole numerous references to the writing and the publication and sort of the reception of Mrs. Dalloway in these letters. And so I was reading through those. And so this is, her letters are great as well. She can be a very funny letter writer, and also she projects. It's interesting to juxtapose her letters and her essays, because in her letters she confesses to self-doubt and to wanting to be successful. Like she very much wants people to like the books she's writing. But in her essays there's this sense of self-assurance where she takes a book, she just opens it and goes, well, here's where I'm going with it. And so it's interesting to juxtapose the confidence, the public confidence in the essays she's publishing, and the private doubts she confesses in her letters. And so I found that to be really interesting, sort of an interesting window into her mind. Now, in terms of some music for the month of March, this is a fairly recent song, but it's one that my daughters now sing every week at least, since our trip up to Utah, and that would be Due West by Kelsey Liu. Fantastic. I'll link it in the description box. I Say Who by Tomoko Sorio, and that is part of sort of a city pop movement from the middle of the century, from the middle of the 20th century. And then Say a Little Prayer by Aretha Franklin, because we were saying a few as Arizona was making it through that semifinal against UConn tonight. Great job by the women's team. We're excited for Sunday. So let me know if you've read any of these works. Let me know if you enjoy the music. And again, I hope you're having a great weekend. Thank you.